Chapter 5, Part 2 of the Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 5, The Red Silk Scarf. 20 minutes later, he stepped out of the underground railway station and made for the Rue de Berne. The victim, who was known in the theatrical world by her stage name of Jenny Saphir, occupied a small flat on the second floor of one of the houses. A policeman took the chief inspector upstairs and showed him the way, through 2 sitting rooms, to a bedroom, where he found the magistrates in charge of the inquiry, together with the divisional surgeon and M. Dudouis, the head of the detective service. Ganimard started at the first glance which he gave into the room. He saw, lying on a sofa, the corpse of a young woman, whose hands clutched a strip of red silk. One of the shoulders, which appeared above the low-cut bodice, bore the marks of 2 wounds surrounded with clotted blood. The distorted and almost blackened features still bore an expression of frenzied terror. The divisional surgeon, who had just finished his examination, said, "My first conclusions are very clear. The victim was twice stabbed with a dagger and afterwards strangled. The immediate cause of death was asphyxia." "By Jove!" thought Ganimard again, remembering Lupin's words and the picture which he had drawn of the crime. The examining magistrate objected. "But the neck shows no discoloration." "She may have been strangled with a napkin or a handkerchief," said the doctor. "Most probably," said the chief detective, "with this silk scarf, which the victim was wearing and a piece of which remains, as though she had clung to it with her 2 hands to protect herself." "But why does only that piece remain?" asked the magistrate. "What has become of the other?" "The other may have been stained with blood and carried off by the murderer. You can plainly distinguish the hurried slashing of the scissors." "By Jove!" said Ganimard, between his teeth, for the 3rd time. "That brute of a Lupin saw everything without seeing a thing." "And what about the motive of the murder?" asked the magistrate. "The locks have been forced, the cupboards turned upside down. Have you anything to tell me, M. Dudouis?" The chief of the detective service replied, "I can at least suggest a supposition, derived from the statements made by the servant. The victim, who enjoyed a greater reputation on account of her looks than through her talent as a singer, went to Russia 2 years ago and brought back with her a magnificent sapphire which she appears to have received from some person of importance at the court. Since then she went by the name of Jenny Saphir, and seems generally to have been very proud of that present, although for prudence sake she never wore it. I dare say that we shall not be far out if we presume the theft of the sapphire to have been the cause of the crime." "But did the maid know where the stone was?" "No, nobody did, and the disorder of the room would tend to prove that the murderer did not know either." "We will question the maid," said the examining magistrate. M. Dudouis took the chief inspector aside and said, "You're looking very old-fashioned, Ganimard. What's the matter? Do you suspect anything?" "Nothing at all, chief." "That's a pity. We could do with a bit of showy work in the department. This is one of a number of crimes, all of the same class, of which we have failed to discover the perpetrator. This time we want the criminal, and quickly." "A difficult job, chief." "It's got to be done. Listen to me, Ganimard. According to what the maid says, Jenny Saphir led a very regular life. For a month past she was in the habit of frequently receiving visits, on her return from the music hall, that is to say, at about 10:30, from a man who would stay until midnight or so. 'He's a society man,' Jenny Saphir used to say, 'and he wants to marry me.' This society man took every precaution to avoid being seen, such as turning up his coat collar and lowering the brim of his hat when he passed the porter's box. And Jenny Saphir always made a point of sending away her maid, even before he came. This is the man whom we have to find." "Has he left no traces?" "None at all. It is obvious that we have to deal with a very clever scoundrel, who prepared his crime beforehand and committed it with every possible chance of escaping unpunished. His arrest would be a great feather in our cap. I rely on you, Ganimard." "Ah, you rely on me, chief," replied the inspector. "Well, we shall see. We shall see. I don't say no, only—" He seemed in a very nervous condition, and his agitation struck M. Dudouis. "Only," continued Ganimard, "only I swear, do you hear, chief? I swear." "What do you swear?" "Nothing. We shall see, chief. We shall see." Ganimard did not finish his sentence until he was outside, alone, and he finished it aloud, stamping his foot, in a tone of the most violent anger. Only I swear to heaven that the arrest shall be effected by my own means, without my employing a single one of the clues with which that villain has supplied me. Ah, no. Ah, no." Railing against Lupin, furious at being mixed up in this business and resolved nevertheless to get to the bottom of it, he wandered aimlessly about the streets. His brain was seething with irritation, and he tried to adjust his ideas a little and to discover, among the chaotic facts, some trifling detail, unperceived by all, unsuspected by Lupin himself, that might lead him to success. He lunched hurriedly at a bar, resumed his stroll, and suddenly stopped, petrified, astounded, and confused. He was walking under the gateway of the very house in the Rue de Surène to which Lupin had enticed him a few hours earlier. A force stronger than his own will was drawing him there once more. The solution of the problem lay there. There and there alone were all the elements of the truth. Do and say what he would, Lupin's assertions were so precise, his calculations so accurate, that, worried to the innermost recesses of his being by so prodigious a display of perspicacity, he could not do other than take up the work at the point where his enemy had left it. Abandoning all further resistance, he climbed the 3 flights of stairs. The door of the flat was open. No one had touched the exhibits. He put them in his pocket and walked away. From that moment, he reasoned and acted, so to speak, mechanically, under the influence of the master whom he could not choose but obey. Admitting that the unknown person whom he was seeking lived in the neighbourhood of the Pont Neuf, it became necessary to discover, somewhere between that bridge and the Rue de Berne, the first-class confectioner's shop, open in the evenings, at which the cakes were bought. This did not take long to find. A pastry cook near the Gare Saint-Lazare showed him some little cardboard boxes, identical in material and shape with the one in Ganimard's possession. Moreover, one of the shop girls remembered having served, on the previous evening, a gentleman whose face was almost concealed in the collar of his fur coat, but whose eyeglass she had happened to notice. "That's one clue checked," thought the inspector. "Our man wears an eyeglass." He next collected the pieces of the racing paper and showed them to a newsvendor, who easily recognized the Turf Illustré. Ganimard at once went to the offices of the Turf and asked to see the list of subscribers. Going through the list, he jotted down the names and addresses of all those who lived anywhere near the Pont Neuf, and principally, because Lupin had said so, those on the left bank of the river. He then went back to the Criminal Investigation Department, took 6 men, and packed them off with the necessary instructions. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the last of these men returned and brought good news with him. A certain M. Prévailles, a subscriber to the Turf, occupied an entresol flat on the Quai des Augustins. On the previous evening, he left his place, wearing a fur coat, took his letters and his paper, the Turf Illustré, from the porter's wife, walked away and returned home at midnight. This M. Prévailles wore a single eyeglass. He was a regular race-goer, and himself owned several hacks, which he either rode himself or jobbed out. The inquiry had taken so short a time, and the results obtained were so exactly in accordance with Lupin's predictions, that Ganimard felt quite overcome on hearing the detective's report. Once more he was measuring the prodigious extent of the resources at Lupin's disposal. Never in the course of his life, and Ganimard was already well advanced in years, had he come across such perspicacity, such a quick and far-seeing mind. He went in search of M. Dudouis. "Everything's ready, Chief. Have you a warrant?" "Eh? I said everything is ready for the arrest, Chief." "You know the name of Jenny Saphir's murderer?" "Yes." "But how? Explain yourself." Ganimard had a sort of scruple of conscience, blushed a little, and nevertheless replied: "An accident, Chief. The murderer threw everything that was likely to compromise him into the Seine. Part of the parcel was picked up and handed to me." "By whom?" "A boatman who refused to give his name for fear of getting into trouble. But I had all the clues I wanted. It was not so difficult as I expected." And the inspector described how he had gone to work. "And you call that an accident?" cried M. Dudouis. "And you say that it was not difficult? Why, it's one of your finest performances. Finish it yourself, Ganimard, and be prudent." Ganimard was eager to get the business done. He went to the Quai des Augustins with his men and distributed them around the house. He questioned the portress, who said that her tenant took his meals out of doors, but made a point of looking in after dinner. A little before 9 o'clock, in fact, leaning out of her window, she warned Ganimard, who at once gave a low whistle. A gentleman in a tall hat and a fur coat was coming along the pavement beside the Seine. He crossed the road and walked up to the house. Ganimard stepped forward. Monsieur Prévailles, I believe. Yes, but who are you? I have a commission to... He had not time to finish his sentence. At the sight of the men appearing out of the shadow, Prévailles quickly retreated to the wall and faced his adversaries, with his back to the door of a shop on the ground floor, the shutters of which were closed. "Stand back!" he cried. "I don't know you." His right hand brandished a heavy stick, while his left was slipped behind him and seemed to be trying to open the door. Ganimard had an impression that the man might escape through this way and through some secret outlet. "None of this nonsense," he said, moving closer to him. "You're caught. You had better come quietly." But just as he was laying hold of Prévailles' stick, Ganimard remembered the warning which Lupin gave him. Prévailles was left-handed, and it was his revolver for which he was feeling behind his back. The inspector ducked his head. He had noticed the man's sudden movement. 2 reports rang out. No one was hit. A second later, Prévailles received a blow under the chin from the butt end of a revolver, which brought him down where he stood. He was entered at the Dépôt soon after 9 o'clock. Ganimard enjoyed a great reputation even at that time. But this capture, so quickly effected, by such very simple means, and at once made public by the police, won him a sudden celebrity. Prévailles was forthwith saddled with all the murders that had remained unpunished, and the newspapers vied with one another in extolling Ganimard's prowess. The case was conducted briskly at the start. It was first of all ascertained that Prévailles, whose real name was Thomas de Roc, had already been in trouble. Moreover, the search instituted in his rooms, while not supplying any fresh proofs, at least led to the discovery of a ball of whipcord similar to the cord used for doing up the parcel, and also to the discovery of daggers which would have produced a wound similar to the wounds on the victim. But on the 8th day everything was changed. Until then Prévailles had refused to reply to the questions put to him. But now, assisted by his counsel, he pleaded a circumstantial alibi and maintained that he was at the Folies Bergères on the night of the murder. As a matter of fact, the pockets of his dinner jacket contained the counterfoil of a stall ticket and a programme of the performance, both bearing the date of that evening. "An alibi prepared in advance," objected the examining magistrate. "Prove it," said Prévailles. The prisoner was confronted with the witnesses for the prosecution. The young lady from the confectioner's thought she knew the gentleman with the eyeglass. The hall porter in the Rue de Berne thought he knew the gentleman who used to come to see Jenny Saphir. But nobody dared to make a more definite statement. The examination, therefore, led to nothing of a precise character, provided no solid basis whereon to found a serious accusation. The judge sent for Ganimard and told him of his difficulty. "I can't possibly persist at this rate. There is no evidence to support the charge." "But surely you are convinced in your own mind, Monsieur le Juge d'Instruction. Prévailles would never have resisted his arrest unless he was guilty." "He says that he thought he was being assaulted. He also says that he never set eyes on Jenny Saphir, and as a matter of fact, we can find no one to contradict his assertion. Then again, admitting that the sapphire has been stolen, we have not been able to find it at his flat." "Nor anywhere else," suggested Ganimard. "Quite true, but that is no evidence against him. I'll tell you what we shall want, Monsieur Ganimard, and that very soon: the other end of this red scarf." "The other end?" "Yes, for it is obvious that, if the murderer took it away with him, the reason was that the stuff is stained with the marks of the blood on his fingers." Ganimard made no reply. For several days he had felt that the whole business was tending to this conclusion. There was no other proof possible. Given the silk scarf, and in no other circumstances, Prévailles' guilt was certain. Now Ganimard's position required that Prévailles' guilt should be established. He was responsible for the arrest. It had cast a glamour around him. He had been praised to the skies as the most formidable adversary of criminals, and he would look absolutely ridiculous if Prévailles were released. Unfortunately, the one and only indispensable proof was in Lupin's pocket. How was he to get hold of it? Ganimard cast about, exhausted himself with fresh investigations, went over the inquiry from start to finish, spent sleepless nights in turning over the mystery of the Rue de Berne, studied the records of Prévailles' life, sent 10 men hunting after the invisible sapphire. Everything was useless. On the 28th of December, the examining magistrate stopped him in one of the passages of the law courts. "Well, Monsieur Ganimard, any news?" "No, Monsieur le Juge d'Instruction." "Then I shall dismiss the case." "Wait one day longer." "What's the use? We want the other end of the scarf. Have you got it?" "I shall have it to-morrow." "To-morrow?" "Yes, but please lend me the piece in your possession." What if I do? If you do, I promise to let you have the whole scarf complete. Very well, that's understood. Ganimard followed the examining magistrate to his room and came out with the piece of silk. Hang it all, he growled. Yes, I will go and fetch the proof, and I shall have it too. Always presuming that Master Lupin has the courage to keep the appointment. In point of fact, he did not doubt for a moment that Master Lupin would have this courage, and that was just what exasperated him. Why had Lupin insisted on this meeting? What was his object, in the circumstances? Anxious, furious, and full of hatred, he resolved to take every precaution necessary not only to prevent his falling into a trap himself, but to make his enemy fall into one, now that the opportunity offered. And on the next day, which was the 29th of December, the date fixed by Lupin, after spending the night in studying the old manor house in the Rue de Surène, and convincing himself that there was no other outlet than the front door, he warned his men that he was going on a dangerous expedition, and arrived with them on the field of battle. He posted them in a café and gave them formal instructions. If he showed himself at one of the third-floor windows, or if he failed to return within an hour, the detectives were to enter the house and arrest anyone who tried to leave it. The chief inspector made sure that his revolver was in working order and that he could take it from his pocket easily. Then he went upstairs. He was surprised to find things as he had left them, the doors open and the locks broken. After ascertaining that the windows of the principal room looked out on the street, he visited the 3 other rooms that made up the flat. There was no one there. Master Lupin was afraid, he muttered, not without a certain satisfaction. Don't be silly, said a voice behind him. Turning round, he saw an old workman, wearing a house-painter's long smock, standing in the doorway. You needn't bother your head, said the man. It's I, Lupin. I've been working in the painter's shop since early morning. This is when we knock off for breakfast, so I came upstairs. He looked at Ganimard with a quizzing smile and cried, "'Pon my word, this is a gorgeous moment I owe you, old chap. I wouldn't sell it for 10 years of your life, and yet you know how I love you. What do you think of it, artist? Wasn't it well thought out and well foreseen? Foreseen from alpha to omega? Did I understand the business? Did I penetrate the mystery of the scarf? I'm not saying that there were no holes in my argument, no links missing in the chain. But what a masterpiece of intelligence, Ganimard! What a reconstruction of events! What an intuition of everything that had taken place, and of everything that was going to take place, from the discovery of the crime to your arrival here in search of a proof! What really marvellous divination! Have you the scarf? Yes, half of it. Have you the other? Here it is. Let's compare. They spread the 2 pieces of silk on the table. The cuts made by the scissors corresponded exactly. Moreover, the colours were identical. But I presume, said Lupin, that this was not the only thing you came for. What you are interested in is seeing the marks of the blood. Come with me, Ganimard. It's rather dark in here. They moved into the next room, which, though it overlooked the courtyard, was lighter, and Lupin held his piece of silk against the window-pane. Look, he said, making room for Ganimard. The inspector gave a start of delight. The marks of the 5 fingers and the print of the palm were distinctly visible. The evidence was undeniable. The murderer had seized the stuff in his blood-stained hand, in the same hand that had stabbed Jenny Saphir and tied the scarf round her neck. And it is the print of a left hand, observed Lupin. Hence my warning, which had nothing miraculous about it, you see. For though I admit, friend of my youth, that you may look upon me as a superior intelligence, I won't have you treat me as a wizard. Ganimard had quickly pocketed the piece of silk. Lupin nodded his head in approval. Quite right, old boy, it's for you. I'm so glad you're glad. And you see, there was no trap about all this, only the wish to oblige, a service between friends, between pals, and also, I confess, a little curiosity. Yes, I wanted to examine this other piece of silk, the one the police had. Don't be afraid, I'll give it back to you. Just a second. Lupin, with a careless movement, played with the tassel at the end of this half of the scarf, while Ganimard listened to him in spite of himself. How ingenious these little bits of women's work are! Did you notice one detail in the maid's evidence? Jenny Saphir was very handy with her needle, and used to make all her own hats and frocks. It is obvious that she made this scarf herself. Besides, I noticed that from the first. I am naturally curious, as I have already told you, and I made a thorough examination of the piece of silk which you have just put in your pocket. Inside the tassel, I found a little sacred medal which the poor girl had stitched into it to bring her luck. Touching, isn't it, Ganimard? A little medal of Our Lady of Good Succour." The inspector felt greatly puzzled and did not take his eyes off the other. And Lupin continued: "Then I said to myself, how interesting it would be to explore the other half of the scarf, the one which the police will find round the victim's neck. For this other half, which I hold in my hands at last, is finished off in the same way. So I shall be able to see if it has a hiding place too, and what's inside it. But look, my friend, isn't it cleverly made? And so simple. All you have to do is to take a skein of red cord and braid it round a wooden cup, leaving a little recess, a little empty space in the middle, very small, of course, but large enough to hold a medal of a saint, or anything, a precious stone, for instance, such as a sapphire." At that moment he finished pushing back the silk cord, and from the hollow of a cup he took between his thumb and forefinger a wonderful blue stone, perfect in respect of size and purity. "Ha! What did I tell you, friend of my youth?" He raised his head. The inspector had turned livid and was staring wild-eyed, as though fascinated by the stone that sparkled before him. He at last realized the whole plot. "You dirty scoundrel!" he muttered, repeating the insults which he had used at the first interview. "You scum of the earth!" The two men were standing one against the other. "Give me back that," said the inspector. Lupin held out the piece of silk. "And the sapphire?" said Ganimard in a peremptory tone. "Don't be silly. Give it back, or what, you idiot?" cried Lupin. "Look here, do you think I put you onto this soft thing for nothing? Give it back. You haven't noticed what I've been about, that's plain. What, for 4 weeks I've kept you on the move like a deer, and you want to... Come, Ganimard, old chap, pull yourself together. Don't you see that you've been playing the good dog for 4 weeks on end? Fetch it, Rover. There's a nice blue pebble over there, which master can't get at. Hunt it, Ganimard, fetch it. Bring it to master. Ah, he's his master's own good little dog. Sit up, beg. Doesn't want a bit of sugar, then?" Ganimard, containing the anger that seethed within him, thought only of one thing, summoning his detectives. And as the room in which he now was looked out on the courtyard, he tried gradually to work his way round to the communicating door. He would then run to the window and break one of the panes. "All the same," continued Lupin, "what a pack of dunderheads you and the rest must be! You've had the silk all this time, and not one of you ever thought of feeling it. Not one of you ever asked himself the reason why the poor girl hung on to her scarf. Not one of you! You just acted at haphazard, without reflecting, without foreseeing anything." The inspector had attained his object. Taking advantage of a second when Lupin had turned away from him, he suddenly wheeled round and grasped the door-handle. But an oath escaped him. The handle did not budge. Lupin burst into a fit of laughing. "Not even that! You did not even foresee that! You lay a trap for me, and you won't admit that I may perhaps smell the thing out beforehand. And you allow yourself to be brought into this room without asking whether I am not bringing you here for a particular reason, and without remembering that the locks are fitted with a special mechanism. Come now, speaking frankly, what do you think of it yourself?" "What do I think of it?" roared Ganimard, beside himself with rage. He had drawn his revolver and was pointing it straight at Lupin's face. "Hands up!" he cried. "That's what I think of it." Lupin placed himself in front of him and shrugged his shoulders. "Sold again," he said. "Hands up, I say, once more." "And sold again, say I. Your deadly weapon won't go off." "What?" "Old Catherine, your housekeeper, is in my service. She damped the charges this morning while you were having your breakfast coffee." Ganimard made a furious gesture, pocketed the revolver and rushed at Lupin. "Well?" said Lupin, stopping him short with a well-aimed kick on the shin. Their clothes were almost touching. They exchanged defiant glances, the glances of two adversaries who mean to come to blows. Nevertheless, there was no fight. The recollection of the earlier struggles made any present struggle useless. And Ganimard, who remembered all his past failures, his vain attacks, Lupin's crushing reprisals, did not lift a limb. There was nothing to be done. He felt it. Lupin had forces at his command against which any individual force simply broke to pieces. So what was the good? "I agree," said Lupin, in a friendly voice, as though answering Ganimard's unspoken thought. "You would do better to let things be as they are. Besides, friend of my youth, think of all that this incident has brought you: fame, the certainty of quick promotion, and, thanks to that, the prospect of a happy and comfortable old age. Surely you don't want the discovery of the sapphire in the head of poor Arsène Lupin in addition? It wouldn't be fair. To say nothing of the fact that poor Arsène Lupin saved your life. Yes, sir. Who warned you at this very spot that Prévailles was left-handed? And is this the way you thank me? It's not pretty of you, Ganimard. Upon my word, you make me blush for you." While chattering, Lupin had gone through the same performance as Ganimard and was now near the door. Ganimard saw that his foe was about to escape him. Forgetting all prudence, he tried to block his way and received a tremendous butt in the stomach, which sent him rolling to the opposite wall. Lupin dexterously touched a spring, turned the handle, opened the door and slipped away, roaring with laughter as he went. 20 minutes later, when Ganimard at last succeeded in joining his men, one of them said to him: "A house painter left the house as his mates were coming back from breakfast, and put a letter into my hand. 'Give that to your governor,' he said." "Which governor?" I asked, but he was gone. "I suppose it's meant for you." "Let's have it." Ganimard opened the letter. It was hurriedly scribbled in pencil and contained these words: "This is to warn you, friend of my youth, against excessive credulity. When a fellow tells you that the cartridges in your revolver are damp, however great your confidence in that fellow may be, even though his name be Arsène Lupin, never allow yourself to be taken in. Fire first, and if the fellow hops the twig, you will have acquired the proof, 1, that the cartridges are not damp, and 2, that old Catherine is the most honest and respectable of housekeepers. One of these days, I hope to have the pleasure of making her acquaintance. Meanwhile, friend of my youth, believe me always affectionately and sincerely yours." Chapter 6. Part 1 of the Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin, by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 6. Shadowed by Death. After he had been round the walls of the property, Arsène Lupin returned to the spot from which he started. It was perfectly clear to him that there was no breach in the walls, and the only way of entering the extensive grounds of the Château de Maupertuis was through a little low door, firmly bolted on the inside, or through the principal gate, which was overlooked by the lodge. "Very well," he said, "we must employ heroic methods." Pushing his way into the copsewood where he had hidden his motor bicycle, he unwound a length of twine from under the saddle and went to a place which he had noticed in the course of his exploration. At this place, which was situated far from the road, on the edge of a wood, a number of large trees, standing inside the park, overlapped the wall. Lupin fastened a stone to the end of the string, threw it up and caught a thick branch, which he drew down to him and bestraddled. The branch, in recovering its position, raised him from the ground. He climbed over the wall, slipped down the tree and sprang lightly on the grass. It was winter, and through the leafless boughs, across the undulating lawns, he could see the little Château de Maupertuis in the distance. Fearing lest he should be perceived, he concealed himself behind a clump of fir trees. From there, with the aid of a field-glass, he studied the dark and melancholy front of the manor house. All the windows were closed, and, as it were, barricaded with solid shutters. The house might easily have been uninhabited. "By Jove!" muttered Lupin. "It's not the liveliest of residences. I shall certainly not come here to end my days." But the clock struck 3. One of the doors on the ground floor opened, and the figure of a woman appeared, a very slender figure wrapped in a brown cloak. The woman walked up and down for a few minutes, and was at once surrounded by birds, to which she scattered crumbs of bread. Then she went down the stone steps that led to the middle lawn and skirted it, taking the path on the right. With his field-glass, Lupin could distinctly see her coming in his direction. She was tall, fair-haired, graceful in appearance, and seemed to be quite a young girl. She walked with a sprightly step, looking at the pale December sun and amusing herself by breaking the little dead twigs on the shrubs along the road. She had gone nearly 2/3 of the distance that separated her from Lupin, when there came a furious sound of barking, and a huge dog, a colossal Danish boarhound, sprang from a neighbouring kennel and stood erect at the end of the chain by which it was fastened. The girl moved a little to one side, without paying further attention to what was doubtless a daily incident. The dog grew angrier than ever, standing on its legs and dragging at its collar, at the risk of strangling itself. 30 or 40 steps farther, yielding probably to an impulse of impatience, the girl turned round and made a gesture with her hand. The Great Dane gave a start of rage, retreated to the back of its kennel and rushed out again, this time unfettered. The girl uttered a cry of mad terror. The dog was covering the space between them, trailing its broken chain behind it. She began to run with all her might, and screamed out desperately for help. But the dog came up with her in a few bounds. She fell at once exhausted, giving herself up for lost. The animal was already upon her, almost touching her. At that exact moment, a shot rang out. The dog turned a complete somersault, recovered its feet, tore the ground and then lay down, giving a number of hoarse, breathless howls, which ended in a dull moan and an indistinct gurgling. And that was all. "Dead," said Lupin, who had hastened up at once, prepared, if necessary, to fire his revolver a second time. The girl had risen and stood pale, still staggering. She looked in great surprise at this man whom she did not know and who had saved her life, and she whispered, "Thank you. I've had a great fright. You were in the nick of time. I thank you, monsieur." Lupin took off his hat. "Allow me to introduce myself, mademoiselle. My name is Paul d'Aubreuil. But before entering into any explanations, I must ask for one moment." He stooped over the dog's dead body and examined the chain at the part where the brute's effort had snapped it. "That's it," he said between his teeth. "It's just as I suspected. By Jupiter, things are moving rapidly. I ought to have come earlier." Returning to the girl's side, he said to her, speaking very quickly, "Mademoiselle, we have not a minute to lose. My presence in these grounds is quite irregular. I do not wish to be surprised here, and this for reasons that concern yourself alone. Do you think that the report can have been heard at the house?" The girl seemed already to have recovered from her emotion, and she replied, with a calmness that revealed all her pluck, "I don't think so." "Is your father in the house to-day?" "My father is ill and has been in bed for months. Besides, his room looks out on the other front." "And the servants?" "Their quarters in the kitchen are also on the other side. No one ever comes to this part. I walk here myself, but nobody else does." "It is probable, therefore, that I have not been seen either, especially as the trees hide us?" "It is most probable." "Then I can speak to you freely?" "Certainly, but I don't understand." "You will, presently. Permit me to be brief. The point is this. 4 days ago, Mademoiselle Jeanne Darcieux—" "That is my name," she said, smiling. "Mademoiselle Jeanne Darcieux," continued Lupin, "wrote a letter to one of her friends, called Marceline, who lives at Versailles." "How do you know all that?" asked the girl in astonishment. "I tore up the letter before I had finished it." "And you flung the pieces on the edge of the road that runs from the house to Vendôme." "That's true. I'd gone out walking." "The pieces were picked up, and they came into my hands next day." "Then you must have read them," said Jeanne Darcieux, betraying a certain annoyance by her manner. "Yes, I committed that indiscretion, and I do not regret it, because I can save you." "Save me? From what?" "From death." Lupin spoke this little sentence in a very distinct voice. The girl gave a shudder. Then she said, "I am not threatened with death?" "Yes, you are, mademoiselle. At the end of October, you were reading on a bench on the terrace where you were accustomed to sit at the same hour every day, when a block of stone fell from the cornice above your head, and you were within a few inches of being crushed." "An accident?" "One fine evening in November, you were walking in the kitchen garden by moonlight. A shot was fired. The bullet whizzed past your ear." "At least I thought so." "Lastly, less than a week ago, the little wooden bridge that crosses the river in the park, 2 yards from the waterfall, gave way while you were on it. You were just able, by a miracle, to catch hold of the root of a tree." Jeanne Darcieux tried to smile. "Very well. But as I wrote to Marceline, these are only a series of coincidences, of accidents." "No, mademoiselle, no. One accident of this sort is allowable. So are 2. And even then. But we have no right to suppose that the chapter of accidents, repeating the same act 3 times in such different and extraordinary circumstances, is a mere amusing coincidence. That is why I thought that I might presume to come to your assistance, and as my intervention can be of no use unless it remains secret, I do not hesitate to make my way in here without walking through the gate. I came in the nick of time, as you said. Your enemy was attacking you once more." "What? Do you think? No, it is impossible. I refuse to believe." Lupin picked up the chain and, showing it to her: "Look at the last link. There is no question but that it has been filed. Otherwise, so powerful a chain as this would never have yielded. Besides, you can see the mark of the file here." Jeanne turned pale, and her pretty features were distorted with terror. "But who can bear me such a grudge?" she gasped. "It's terrible. I've never done any one harm, and yet you are certainly right. Worse still—" She finished her sentence in a lower voice. "Worse still, I'm wondering whether the same danger does not threaten my father." "Has he been attacked also?" "No, for he never stirs from his room. But his is such a mysterious illness. He has no strength. He cannot walk at all. In addition to that, he is subject to fits of suffocation, as though his heart stopped beating. Oh, what an awful thing!" Lupin realized all the authority which he was able to assert at such a moment, and he said: "Have no fear, mademoiselle. If you obey me blindly, I shall be sure to succeed." Yes, I am quite willing. But all this is so terrible." "Trust me, I beg of you. And please listen to me. I shall want a few particulars." He rapped out a number of questions, which Jeanne Darcieux answered hurriedly. "That animal was never let loose, was he?" "Never." "Who used to feed him?" "The lodge-keeper. He brought him his food every evening." "Consequently, he could go near him without being bitten?" "Yes, and he only, for the dog was very savage." "You don't suspect the man?" "Oh, no. Baptiste? Never." "And you can't think of anybody?" "No. Our servants are quite devoted to us. They are very fond of me." "You have no friends staying in the house?" "No." "No brother?" "No." "Then your father is your only protector?" "Yes, and I have told you the condition he is in." "Have you told him of the different attempts?" "Yes, and it was wrong of me to do so. Our doctor, old Dr. Guéroult, forbade me to cause him the least excitement." "Your mother?" "I don't remember her. She died 16 years ago. Just 16 years ago." "How old were you then?" "I was not quite 5 years old." "And were you living here?" "We were living in Paris. My father only bought this place the year after." Lupin was silent for a few moments. Then he concluded: "Very well, mademoiselle. I am obliged to you. Those particulars are all I need for the present. Besides, it would not be wise for us to remain together longer." "But," she said, "the lodge-keeper will find the dog soon. Who will have killed him?" "You, mademoiselle, to defend yourself against an attack." "I never carry firearms." "I'm afraid you do," said Lupin, smiling, "because you killed the dog, and there is no one but you who could have killed him. For that matter, let them think what they please. The great thing is that I shall not be suspected when I come to the house." "To the house? Do you intend to?" "Yes. I don't yet know how, but I shall come, this very evening. So, once more, be easy in your mind. I will answer for everything." Jeanne looked at him and, dominated by him, conquered by his air of assurance and good faith, she said simply: "I am quite easy." "Then all will go well. Till this evening, mademoiselle." "Till this evening." She walked away, and Lupin, following her with his eyes until the moment when she disappeared round the corner of the house, murmured: "What a pretty creature! It would be a pity if any harm were to come to her. Luckily, Arsène Lupin is keeping his weather eye open." Taking care not to be seen, with eyes and ears attentive to the least sight or sound, he inspected every nook and corner of the grounds, looked for the little low door which he had noticed outside, and which was the door of the kitchen garden, drew the bolt, took the key and then skirted the walls and found himself once more near the tree which he had climbed. 2 minutes later, he was mounting his motor-cycle. The village of Maupertuis lay quite close to the estate. Lupin inquired and learnt that Dr. Guéroult lived next door to the church. He rang, was shown into the consulting room and introduced himself by his name of Paul Daubreuil, of the Rue de Surène, Paris, adding that he had official relations with the detective service, a fact which he requested might be kept secret. He had become acquainted, by means of a torn letter, with the incidents that had endangered Mademoiselle Darcieux's life, and he had come to that young lady's assistance. Dr. Guéroult, an old country practitioner, who idolized Jeanne, on hearing Lupin's explanations, at once admitted that those incidents constituted undeniable proofs of a plot. He showed great concern, offered his visitor hospitality, and kept him to dinner. The two men talked at length. In the evening, they walked round to the manor house together. The doctor went to the sick man's room, which was on the first floor, and asked leave to bring up a young colleague, to whom he intended soon to make over his practice, when he retired. Lupin, on entering, saw Jeanne Darcieux seated by her father's bedside. She suppressed a movement of surprise and, at a sign from the doctor, left the room. The consultation thereupon took place in Lupin's presence. M. Darcieux's face was worn, with much suffering, and his eyes were bright with fever. He complained particularly that day of his heart. After the auscultation, he questioned the doctor with obvious anxiety, and each reply seemed to give him relief. He also spoke of Jeanne and expressed his conviction that they were deceiving him and that his daughter had escaped yet more accidents. He continued perturbed, in spite of the doctor's denials. He wanted to have the police informed and inquiries set on foot. But his excitement tired him and he gradually dropped off to sleep. Lupin stopped the doctor in the passage. "Come, doctor, give me your exact opinion. Do you think that Dr. Darcieux's illness can be attributed to an outside cause?" "How do you mean?" "Well, suppose that the same enemy should be interested in removing both father and daughter." The doctor seemed struck by the suggestion. "Upon my word, there is something in what you say. The father's illness at times adopts such a very unusual character. For instance, the paralysis of the legs, which is almost complete, ought to be accompanied by—" The doctor reflected for a moment and then said in a low voice, "You think it's poison, of course. But what poison? Besides, I see no toxic symptoms. It would have to be— But what are you doing? What's the matter?" The two men were talking outside a little sitting-room on the first floor, where Jeanne, seizing the opportunity while the doctor was with her father, had begun her evening meal. Lupin, who was watching her through the open door, saw her lift a cup to her lips and take a few sups. Suddenly he rushed at her and caught her by the arm. "What are you drinking there?" "What?" she said, taken aback. "Only tea." "You pulled a face of disgust. What made you do that?" "I don't know. I thought—" "You thought what?" That it tasted rather bitter. But I expect that comes from the medicine I mixed with it." "What medicine?" "Some drops which I take at dinner. The drops which you prescribed for me, you know, doctor." "Yes," said Dr. Guéroult, "but that medicine has no taste of any kind. You know it hasn't, Jeanne, for you have been taking it for a fortnight, and this is the first time." "Quite right," said the girl. "And this does have a taste. There. Oh! My mouth is still burning." Dr. Guéroult now took a sip from the cup. "Pah!" he exclaimed, spitting it out again. "There's no mistake about it." Lupin, on his side, was examining the bottle containing the medicine, and he asked, "Where is this bottle kept in the daytime?" But Jeanne was unable to answer. She had put her hand to her heart, and, wan-faced, with staring eyes, seemed to be suffering great pain. It hurts. It hurts," she stammered. The two men quickly carried her to her room and laid her on the bed. "She ought to have an emetic," said Lupin. "Open the cupboard," said the doctor. "You'll see a medicine case. Have you got it? Take out one of those little tubes. Yes, that one. And now some hot water. You'll find some on the tea tray in the other room." Jeanne's own maid came running up in answer to the bell. Lupin told her that Mademoiselle Darcieux had been taken unwell for some unknown reason. He next returned to the little dining-room, inspected the sideboard and the cupboards, went down to the kitchen and pretended that the doctor had sent him to ask about M. Darcieux's diet. Without appearing to do so, he catechized the cook, the butler and Baptiste, the lodge-keeper, who had his meals at the manor-house with the servants. Then he went back to the doctor. "Well?" "She's asleep." "Any danger?" "No. Fortunately, she had only taken 2 or 3 sips. But this is the second time to-day that you have saved her life, as the analysis of this bottle will show." "Quite superfluous to make an analysis, doctor. There is no doubt about the fact that there has been an attempt at poisoning." "By whom?" "I can't say. But the demon who is engineering all this business clearly knows the ways of the house. He comes and goes as he pleases, walks about in the park, files the dog's chain, mixes poison with the food, and, in short, moves and acts precisely as though he were living the life of her, or rather of those, whom he wants to put away." "You really believe that M. Darcieux is threatened with the same danger?" "I have not a doubt of it." "Then it must be one of the servants. But that is most unlikely. Do you think—" "I think nothing, doctor. I know nothing. All I can say is that the situation is most tragic, and that we must be prepared for the worst. Death is here, doctor, shadowing the people in this house, and it will soon strike at those whom it is pursuing." "What's to be done?" "Watch, doctor. Let us pretend that we are alarmed about M. Darcieux's health and spend the night in here. The bedrooms of both the father and daughter are close by. If anything happens, we are sure to hear." There was an easy-chair in the room. They arranged to sleep in it and turn about. In reality, Lupin slept for only 2 or 3 hours. In the middle of the night, he left the room, without disturbing his companion, carefully looked round the whole of the house, and walked out through the principal gate. Chapter 5 Chapter 6, Part 2 of the Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 6. Shadowed by Death. He reached Paris on his motorcycle at 9 o'clock in the morning. 2 of his friends, to whom he telephoned on the road, met him there. They all 3 spent the day in making searches which Lupin had planned out beforehand. He set out again hurriedly at 6 o'clock. And never, perhaps, as he told me subsequently, did he risk his life with greater temerity than in his breakneck ride, at a mad rate of speed, on a foggy December evening, with the light of his lamp hardly able to pierce through the darkness. He sprang from his bicycle outside the gate, which was still open, ran to the house and reached the first floor in a few bounds. There was no one in the little dining room. Without hesitating, without knocking, he walked into Jeanne's bedroom. "Oh, here you are!" he said, with a sigh of relief, seeing Jeanne and the doctor sitting side by side, talking. "What, any news?" asked the doctor, alarmed at seeing such a state of agitation in a man whose coolness he had had occasion to observe. "No," said Lupin, "no news. And here?" "None here either. We have just left M. Darcieux. He has had an excellent day, and he ate his dinner with a good appetite. As for Jeanne, you can see for yourself, she has all her pretty colour back again." "Then she must go." "Go? But it's out of the question," protested the girl. "You must go, you must!" cried Lupin, with real violence, stamping his foot on the floor. He at once mastered himself, spoke a few words of apology and then, for 3 or 4 minutes, preserved a complete silence, which the doctor and Jeanne were careful not to disturb. At last he said to the young girl: "You shall go to-morrow morning, mademoiselle. It will be only for 1 or 2 weeks. I will take you to your friend at Versailles, the one to whom you were writing. I entreat you to get everything ready to-night, without concealment of any kind. Let the servants know that you are going. On the other hand, the doctor will be good enough to tell M. Darcieux, and give him to understand, with every possible precaution, that this journey is essential to your safety. Besides, he can join you as soon as his strength permits. That's settled, is it not?" "Yes," she said, absolutely dominated by Lupin's gentle and imperious voice. "In that case," he said, "be as quick as you can, and do not stir from your room." "But," said the girl with a shudder, "am I to stay alone to-night?" "Fear nothing. Should there be the least danger, the doctor and I will come back. Do not open your door unless you hear 3 very light taps." Jeanne at once rang for her maid. The doctor went to M. Darcieux, while Lupin had some supper brought to him in the little dining room. "That's done," said the doctor, returning to him in 20 minutes' time. "M. Darcieux did not raise any great difficulty. As a matter of fact, he himself thinks it just as well that we should send Jeanne away." They then went downstairs together and left the house. On reaching the lodge, Lupin called the keeper. "You can shut the gate, my man. If M. Darcieux should want us, send for us at once." The clock of Maupertuis church struck 10. The sky was overcast with black clouds, through which the moon broke at moments. The 2 men walked on for 60 or 70 yards. They were nearing the village, when Lupin gripped his companion by the arm. "Stop!" "What on earth's the matter?" exclaimed the doctor. "The matter is this," Lupin jerked out, "that if my calculations turn out right, if I have not misjudged the business from start to finish, Mademoiselle Darcieux will be murdered before the night is out."
What's that?" gasped the doctor in dismay. "But then why did we go?"
"With the precise object that the miscreant, who is watching all our movements in the dark, may not postpone his crime and may perpetrate it, not at the hour chosen by himself, but at the hour which I have decided upon."
"Then we are returning to the manor house."
"Yes, of course we are, but separately."
"In that case, let us go at once."
"Listen to me, doctor," said Lupin, in a steady voice, "and let us waste no time in useless words. Above all, we must defeat any attempt to watch us. You will therefore go straight home and not come out again until you are quite certain that you have not been followed. You will then make for the walls of the property, keeping to the left till you come to the little door of the kitchen garden. Here is the key. When the church clock strikes 11, open the door very gently and walk right up to the terrace at the back of the house. The 5th window is badly fastened. You have only to climb over the balcony. As soon as you are inside Mlle. Darcieux's room, bolt the door and don't budge. You quite understand? Don't budge, either of you, whatever happens. I have noticed that Mlle. Darcieux leaves her dressing-room window ajar. Isn't that so?" "Yes, it's a habit which I taught her." "That's the way they'll come." "And you?" "That's the way I shall come also."
"And do you know who the villain is?"
Lupin hesitated and then replied: "No, I don't know, and that is just how we shall find out. But I implore you, keep cool. Not a word, not a movement, whatever happens." "I promise you." "I want more than that, doctor. You must give me your word of honour."
"I give you my word of honour."
The doctor went away. Lupin at once climbed a neighbouring mound from which he could see the windows of the 1st and 2nd floor. Several of them were lighted. He waited for some little time. The lights went out one by one. Then, taking a direction opposite to that in which the doctor had gone, he branched off to the right and skirted the wall until he came to the clump of trees near which he had hidden his motor-cycle on the day before. 11 o'clock struck. He calculated the time which it would take the doctor to cross the kitchen garden and make his way into the house. "That's 1 point scored," he muttered. "Everything's all right on that side. And now, Lupin to the rescue? The enemy won't be long before he plays his last trump. And by all the gods, I must be there." He went through the same performance as on the first occasion, pulled down the branch and hoisted himself to the top of the wall, from which he was able to reach the bigger boughs of the tree. Just then he pricked up his ears. He seemed to hear a rustling of dead leaves, and he actually perceived a dark form moving on the level 30 yards away. "Hang it all!" he said to himself. "I'm done. The scoundrel has smelt a rat." A moonbeam pierced through the clouds. Lupin distinctly saw the man take aim. He tried to jump to the ground and turned his head. But he felt something hit him in the chest, heard the sound of a report, uttered an angry oath and came crashing down from branch to branch, like a corpse. Meanwhile, Dr. Guéroult, following Arsène Lupin's instructions, had climbed the ledge of the 5th window and groped his way to the 1st floor. On reaching Jeanne's room, he tapped lightly 3 times at the door and, immediately on entering, pushed the bolt. "Lie down at once," he whispered to the girl, who had not taken off her things. "You must appear to have gone to bed. It's cold in here. Is the window open in your dressing-room?" "Yes. Would you like me to—" "No, leave it as it is. They are coming." "They are coming?" spluttered Jeanne, in a fright. "Yes, beyond a doubt." "But who? Do you suspect anyone?" "I don't know who. I expect that there is someone hidden in the house, or in the park." "Oh, I feel so frightened." "Don't be frightened. The sportsman who's looking after you seems jolly clever and makes a point of playing a safe game. I expect he's on the lookout in the court." The doctor put out the night-light, went to the window and raised the blind. A narrow cornice running along the 1st story prevented him from seeing more than a distant part of the courtyard, and he came back and sat down by the bed. Some very painful minutes passed, minutes that appeared to them interminably long. The clock in the village struck, but taken up as they were with all the little noises of the night, they hardly noticed the sound. They listened, listened with all their nerves on edge. "Did you hear?" whispered the doctor. "Yes, yes," said Jeanne, sitting up in bed. Lie down," he said presently. "There's someone coming." There was a little tapping sound outside, against the cornice. Next came a series of indistinct noises, the nature of which they could not make out for certain. But they had a feeling that the window in the dressing-room was being opened wider, for they were buffeted by gusts of cold air. Suddenly it became quite clear. There was someone next door. The doctor, whose hand was trembling a little, seized his revolver. Nevertheless, he did not move, remembering the formal orders which he had received and fearing to act against them. The room was in absolute darkness, and they were unable to see where the adversary was, but they felt his presence. They followed his invisible movements, the sound of his footsteps deadened by the carpet, and they did not doubt but that he had already crossed the threshold of the room. And the adversary stopped. Of that they were certain. He was standing 6 steps away from the bed, motionless, undecided perhaps, seeking to pierce the darkness with his keen eyes. Jeanne's hand, icy cold and clammy, trembled in the doctor's grasp. With his other hand, the doctor clutched his revolver, with his finger on the trigger. In spite of his pledged word, he did not hesitate. If the adversary touched the end of the bed, the shot would be fired at a venture. The adversary took another step and then stopped again. And there was something awful about that silence, that impassive silence, that darkness in which those human beings were peering at one another, wildly. Who was it looming in the murky darkness? Who was the man? What horrible enmity was it that turned his hand against the girl, and what abominable aim was he pursuing? Terrified though they were, Jeanne and the doctor thought only of that one thing: to see, to learn the truth, to gaze upon the adversary's face. He took one more step and did not move again. It seemed to them that his figure stood out, darker, against the dark space, and that his arm rose slowly, slowly. A minute passed, and then another minute. And suddenly, beyond the man, on the right, a sharp click. A bright light flashed, was flung upon the man, lit him full in the face, remorselessly. Jeanne gave a cry of affright. She had seen, standing over her, with a dagger in his hand, she had seen her father. Almost at the same time, though the light was already turned off, there came a report. The doctor had fired. "Dash it all, don't shoot!" roared Lupin. He threw his arms round the doctor, who choked out, "Didn't you see? Didn't you see? Listen, he's escaping." "Let him escape. It's the best thing that could happen." He pressed the spring of his electric lantern again, ran to the dressing-room, made certain that the man had disappeared, and returning quietly to the table, lit the lamp. Jeanne lay on her bed, pallid, in a dead faint. The doctor, huddled in his chair, emitted inarticulate sounds. "Come," said Lupin, laughing. "Pull yourself together. There is nothing to excite ourselves about. It's all over." "Her father! Her father!" moaned the old doctor. "If you please, doctor, Mademoiselle Darcieux is ill. Look after her." Without more words, Lupin went back to the dressing-room and stepped out on the window-ledge. A ladder stood against the ledge. He ran down it. Skirting the wall of the house, 20 steps farther, he tripped over the rungs of a rope-ladder, which he climbed, and found himself in M. Darcieux's bedroom. The room was empty. "Just so," he said. "My gentleman did not like the position and has cleared out. Here's wishing him a good journey. And, of course, the door is bolted?" "Exactly. That is how our sick man, tricking his worthy medical attendant, used to get up at night in full security, fasten his rope-ladder to the balcony, and prepare his little games. He's no fool, is friend Darcieux." He drew the bolts and returned to Jeanne's room. The doctor, who was just coming out of the doorway, drew him to the little dining-room. "She's asleep. Don't let us disturb her. She has had a bad shock and will take some time to recover." Lupin poured himself out a glass of water and drank it down. Then he took a chair and calmly, "Pooh, she'll be all right by to-morrow." "What do you say?" "I say that she'll be all right by to-morrow." "Why?" "In the first place, because it did not strike me that Mademoiselle Darcieux felt any very great affection for her father." "Never mind. Think of it. A father who tries to kill his daughter. A father who, for months on end, repeats his monstrous attempt 4, 5, 6 times over again. Well, isn't that enough to blight a less sensitive soul than Jeanne's for good and all? What a hateful memory!" "She will forget." "One does not forget such a thing as that." "She will forget, doctor, and for a very simple reason." "Explain yourself." "She is not M. Darcieux's daughter." "Eh?" I repeat, she is not that villain's daughter."
"What do you mean? Monsieur Darcieux?"
"Monsieur Darcieux is only her stepfather. She had just been born when her father, the real father, died. Jeanne's mother then married a cousin of her husband's, a man bearing the same name, and she died within a year of her second wedding. She left Jeanne in Monsieur Darcieux's charge. He first took her abroad and then bought this country house, and as nobody knew him in the neighbourhood, he represented the child as being his daughter. She herself did not know the truth about her birth." The doctor sat confounded. He asked, "Are you sure of your facts?" "I spent my day in the town halls of the Paris municipalities. I searched the registers. I interviewed 2 solicitors. I have seen all the documents. There is no doubt possible." "But that does not explain the crime, or rather the series of crimes." "Yes, it does," declared Lupin. "And from the start, from the first hour when I meddled in this business, some words which Mademoiselle Darcieux used made me suspect that direction which my investigations must take. 'I was not quite 5 years old when my mother died,' she said. That was 16 years ago. Mademoiselle Darcieux, therefore, was nearly 21. That is to say, she was on the verge of attaining her majority. I at once saw that this was an important detail. The day on which you reach your majority is the day on which your accounts are rendered. What was the financial position of Mademoiselle Darcieux, who was her mother's natural heiress? Of course, I did not think of the father for a second. To begin with, one can't imagine a thing like that. And then the farce which Monsieur Darcieux was playing, helpless, bedridden, ill—" "Really ill?" interrupted the doctor. "All this diverted suspicion from him, the more so as I believe that he himself was exposed to criminal attacks. But was there not in the family some person who would be interested in their removal? My journey to Paris revealed the truth to me. Mademoiselle Darcieux inherits a large fortune from her mother, of which her stepfather draws the income. The solicitor was to have called a meeting of the family in Paris next month. The truth would have been out. It meant ruin to Monsieur Darcieux." "Then he had put no money by?" "Yes, but he had lost a great deal as the result of unfortunate speculations." "But after all, Jeanne would not have taken the management of her fortune out of his hands." "There is one detail which you do not know, doctor, and which I learned from reading the torn letter. Mademoiselle Darcieux is in love with the brother of Marceline, her Versailles friend. Monsieur Darcieux was opposed to the marriage. And, you now see the reason, she was waiting until she came of age to be married." "You're right," said the doctor. "You're right. It meant his ruin." "His absolute ruin. One chance of saving himself remained, the death of his stepdaughter, of whom he is the next heir." "Certainly, but on condition that no one suspected him." "Of course. And that is why he contrived the series of accidents, so that the death might appear to be due to misadventure. And that is why I, on my side, wishing to bring things to a head, asked you to tell him of Mademoiselle Darcieux's impending departure. From that moment, it was no longer enough for the would-be sick man to wander about the grounds and the passages, in the dark, and execute some leisurely thought-out plan. No, he had to act at once, without preparation, violently, dagger in hand. I had no doubt that he would decide to do it, and he did." "Then he had no suspicions?" "Of me, yes. He felt that I would return to night, and he kept a watch at the place where I had already climbed the wall." "Well?" "Well," said Lupin, laughing, "I received a bullet full in the chest, or rather my pocket-book received a bullet. Here, you can see the hole. So I tumbled from the tree like a dead man. Thinking that he was rid of his only adversary, he went back to the house. I saw him prowl about for 2 hours. Then, making up his mind, he went to the coach-house, took a ladder and set it against the window. I had only to follow him." The doctor reflected and said, "You could have collared him earlier. Why did you let him come up? It was a sore trial for Jeanne, and unnecessary." "On the contrary, it was indispensable. Mademoiselle Darcieux would never have accepted the truth. It was essential that she should see the murderer's very face. You must tell her all the circumstances when she awakes. She will soon be well again." "But Monsieur Darcieux?" "You can explain his disappearance as you think best. A sudden journey, a fit of madness. There will be a few inquiries, and you may be sure that he will never be heard of again." The doctor nodded his head. "Yes, that is so. That is so. You are right. You have managed all this business with extraordinary skill, and Jeanne owes you her life. She will thank you in person. But now, can I be of use to you in any way? You told me that you were connected with the detective service. Will you allow me to write and praise your conduct, your courage?" Lupin began to laugh. "Certainly. A letter of that kind will do me a world of good. You might write to my immediate superior, Chief Inspector Ganimard. He will be glad to hear that his favourite officer, Paul Daubreuil, of the Rue de Surène, has once again distinguished himself by a brilliant action. As it happens, I have an appointment to meet him about a case of which you may have heard, the case of the red scarf. How pleased my dear Monsieur Ganimard will be. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of the Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 7. A tragedy in the forest of Morges. The village was terror-stricken. It was on a Sunday morning. The peasants of Saint-Nicolas and the neighbourhood were coming out of church and spreading across the square when, suddenly, the women who were walking ahead and who had already turned into the high road fell back with loud cries of dismay. At the same moment, an enormous motor-car, looking like some appalling monster, came tearing into sight at a headlong rate of speed. Amid the shouts of the madly scattering people, it made straight for the church, swerved, just as it seemed about to dash itself to pieces against the steps, grazed the wall of the presbytery, regained the continuation of the national road, dashed along, turned the corner and disappeared, without, by some incomprehensible miracle, having so much as brushed against any of the persons crowding the square. But they had seen. They had seen a man in the driver's seat, wrapped in a goatskin coat, with a fur cap on his head and his face disguised in a pair of large goggles, and with him, on the front of that seat, flung back, bent in two, a woman whose head, all covered with blood, hung down over the bonnet. And they had heard. They had heard the woman's screams, screams of horror, screams of agony. And it was all such a vision of hell and carnage that the people stood, for some seconds, motionless, stupefied. "Blood!" roared somebody. There was blood everywhere, on the cobblestones of the square, on the ground hardened by the first frosts of autumn, and when a number of men and boys rushed off in pursuit of the motor, they had but to take those sinister marks for their guide. The marks, on their part, followed the high road, but in a very strange manner, going from one side to the other and leaving a zigzag track in the wake of the tires that made those who saw it shudder. How was it that the car had not bumped against that tree? How had it been righted, instead of smashing into that bank? What novice, what madman, what drunkard, what frightened criminal was driving that motor car with such astounding bounds and swerves? One of the peasants declared, "They will never do the turn in the forest." And another said, "Of course they won't. She's bound to upset." The forest of Morges began at half a mile beyond Saint-Nicolas, and the road, which was straight up to that point, except for a slight bend where it left the village, started climbing, immediately after entering the forest, and made an abrupt turn among the rocks and trees. No motor car was able to take this turn without first slackening speed. There were posts to give notice of the danger. The breathless peasants reached the quincunx of beeches that formed the edge of the forest, and one of them at once cried, "There you are! What? Upset!" The car, a limousine, had turned turtle and lay smashed, twisted and shapeless. Beside it, the woman's dead body. But the most horrible, sordid, stupefying thing was the woman's head, crushed, flattened, invisible under a block of stone, a huge block of stone lodged there by some unknown and prodigious agency. As for the man in the goatskin coat, he was nowhere to be found. He was not found on the scene of the accident. He was not found either in the neighbourhood. Moreover, some workmen coming down the Côte de Morges declared that they had not seen anybody. The man, therefore, had taken refuge in the woods. The gendarmes, who were at once sent for, made a minute search, assisted by the peasants, but discovered nothing. In the same way, the examining magistrates, after a close inquiry lasting for several days, found no clue capable of throwing the least light upon this inscrutable tragedy. On the contrary, the investigations only led to further mysteries and further improbabilities. Thus it was ascertained that the block of stone came from where there had been a landslip, at least 40 yards away, and the murderer, in a few minutes, had carried it all that distance and flung it on his victim's head. On the other hand, the murderer, who was most certainly not hiding in the forest, for if so he must inevitably have been discovered, the forest being of limited extent, had the audacity, 8 days after the crime, to come back to the turn on the hill and leave his goatskin coat there. Why? With what object? There was nothing in the pockets of the coat, except a corkscrew and a napkin. What did it all mean? Inquiries were made of the builder of the motor car, who recognized the limousine as one which he had sold, 3 years ago, to a Russian. The said Russian, declared the manufacturer, had sold it again at once. To whom? No one knew. The car bore no number. Then again, it was impossible to identify the dead woman's body. Her clothes and underclothing were not marked in any way, and the face was quite unknown. Meanwhile, detectives were going along the National Road in the direction opposite to that taken by the actors in this mysterious tragedy. But who was to prove that the car had followed that particular road on the previous night? They examined every yard of the ground, they questioned everybody. At last they succeeded in learning that, on the Saturday evening, a limousine had stopped outside a grocer's shop in a small town situated about 200 miles from Saint-Nicolas, on a highway branching out of the National Road. The driver had first filled his tank, bought some spare cans of petrol, and lastly taken away a small stock of provisions: a ham, fruit, biscuits, wine, and a half bottle of 3-star brandy. There was a lady on the driver's seat. She did not get down. The blinds of the limousine were drawn. One of these blinds was seen to move several times. The shopman was positive that there was somebody inside. Presuming the shopman's evidence to be correct, then the problem became even more complicated, for so far no clue had revealed the presence of a third person. Meanwhile, as the travellers had supplied themselves with provisions, it remained to be discovered what they had done with them and what had become of the remains. The detectives retraced their steps. It was not until they came to the fork of the 2 roads, at a spot 11 or 12 miles from Saint-Nicolas, that they met a shepherd who, in answer to their questions, directed them to a neighbouring field, hidden from view behind the screen of bushes, where he had seen an empty bottle and other things. The detectives were convinced at the first examination. The motor car had stopped there, and the unknown travellers, probably after a night's rest in their car, had breakfasted and resumed their journey in the course of the morning. One unmistakable proof was the half bottle of 3-star brandy sold by the grocer. This bottle had its neck broken clean off with a stone. The stone employed for the purpose was picked up, as was the neck of the bottle, with its cork, covered with a tin-foil seal. The seal showed marks of attempts that had been made to uncork the bottle in the ordinary manner. The detectives continued their search and followed a ditch that ran along the field at right angles to the road. It ended in a little spring, hidden under brambles, which seemed to emit an offensive smell. On lifting the brambles, they perceived a corpse, the corpse of a man whose head had been smashed in, so that it formed little more than a sort of pulp, swarming with vermin. The body was dressed in jacket and trousers of dark brown leather. The pockets were empty. No papers, no pocket-book, no watch. The grocer and his shopman were summoned and, 2 days later, formally identified, by his dress and figure, the traveller who had bought the petrol and provisions on the Saturday evening. The whole case, therefore, had to be reopened on a fresh basis. The authorities were confronted with a tragedy no longer enacted by 2 persons, a man and a woman, of whom one had killed the other, but by 3 persons, including 2 victims, of whom one was the very man who was accused of killing his companion. As to the murderer, there was no doubt. He was the person who travelled inside the motor car and who took the precaution to remain concealed behind the curtains. He had first got rid of the driver and rifled his pockets, and then, after wounding the woman, carried her off in a mad dash for death. Given a fresh case, unexpected discoveries, unforeseen evidence, one might have hoped that the mystery would be cleared up, or at least that the inquiry would point a few steps along the road to the truth. But not at all. The corpse was simply placed beside the first corpse. New problems were added to the old. The accusation of murder was shifted from the one to the other. And there it ended. Outside those tangible, obvious facts, there was nothing but darkness. The name of the woman, the name of the man, the name of the murderer were so many riddles. And then what had become of the murderer? If he had disappeared from one moment to the other, that in itself would have been a tolerably curious phenomenon. But the phenomenon was actually something very like a miracle, inasmuch as the murderer had not absolutely disappeared. He was there. He made a practice of returning to the scene of the catastrophe. In addition to the goatskin coat, a fur cap was picked up one day, and by way of an unparalleled prodigy, one morning, after a whole night spent on guard in the rock, beside the famous turning, the detectives found, on the grass of the turning itself, a pair of motor goggles, broken, rusty, dirty, done for. How had the murderer managed to bring back those goggles unseen by the detectives? And above all, why had he brought them back? Men's brains reeled in the presence of such abnormalities. They were almost afraid to pursue the ambiguous adventure. They received the impression of a heavy, stifling, breathless atmosphere, which dimmed the eyes and baffled the most clear-sighted. The magistrate in charge of the case fell ill. 4 days later, his successor confessed that the matter was beyond him. 2 tramps were arrested and at once released. Another was pursued, but not caught. Moreover, there was no evidence of any sort or kind against him. In short, it was nothing but one helpless muddle of mist and contradiction. An accident, the merest accident, led to the solution, or rather produced a series of circumstances that ended by leading to the solution. A reporter on the staff of an important Paris paper, who had been sent to make investigations on the spot, concluded his article with the following words: "I repeat, therefore, that we must wait for fresh events, fresh facts. We must wait for some lucky accident. As things stand, we are simply wasting our time. The elements of truth are not even sufficient to suggest a plausible theory. We are in the midst of the most absolute, painful, impenetrable darkness. There is nothing to be done. All the Sherlock Holmeses in the world would not know what to make of the mystery, and Arsène Lupin himself, if you will allow me to say so, would have to pay forfeit here." On the day after the appearance of that article, the newspaper in question printed this telegram: "Have sometimes paid forfeit, but never over such a silly thing as this. The Saint Nicolas tragedy is a mystery for babies." And the editor added: "We insert this telegram as a matter of curiosity, for it is obviously the work of a wag. Arsène Lupin, past master though he be in the art of practical joking, would be the last man to display such childish flippancy." 2 days elapsed, and then the paper published the famous letter, so precise and categorical in its conclusions, in which Arsène Lupin furnished the solution of the problem. I quote it in full: "Sir, you have taken me on my weak side by defying me. You challenge me, and I accept the challenge. And I will begin by declaring once more that the Saint Nicolas tragedy is a mystery for babies. I know nothing so simple, so natural, and the proof of the simplicity shall lie in the succinctness of my demonstration. It is contained in these few words: when a crime seems to go beyond the ordinary scope of things, when it seems unusual and stupid, then there are many chances that its explanation is to be found in superordinary, supernatural, superhuman motives. I say that there are many chances, for we must always allow for the part played by absurdity in the most logical and commonplace events. But of course it is impossible to see things as they are, and not to take account of the absurd and the disproportionate. I was struck from the very beginning by that very evident character of unusualness. We have first of all the awkward, zigzag course of the motor car, which would give one the impression that the car was driven by a novice. People have spoken of a drunkard or a madman, a justifiable supposition in itself. But neither madness nor drunkenness would account for the incredible strength required to transport, especially in so short a space of time, the stone with which the unfortunate woman's head was crushed. That proceeding called for a muscular power so great that I do not hesitate to look upon it as a second sign of the unusualness that marks the whole tragedy. And why move that enormous stone to finish off the victim, when a mere pebble would have done the work? Why again was the murderer not killed, or at least reduced to a temporary state of helplessness, in the terrible somersault turned by the car? How did he disappear? And why, having disappeared, did he return to the scene of the accident? Why did he throw his fur coat there? Then on another day his cap, then on another day his goggles? Unusual, useless, stupid acts. Why, besides, convey that wounded, dying woman on the driver's seat of the car, where everybody could see her? Why do that, instead of putting her inside, or flinging her into some corner, dead, just as the man was flung under the brambles in the ditch? Unusualness, stupidity. Everything in the whole story is absurd. Everything points to hesitation, incoherency, awkwardness, the silliness of a child, or rather of a mad, blundering savage, of a brute. Look at the bottle of brandy. There was a corkscrew. It was found in the pocket of the greatcoat. Did the murderer use it? Yes, the marks of the corkscrew can be seen on the seal. But the operation was too complicated for him. He broke the neck with a stone. Always stones. Observe that detail. They are the only weapon, the only implement which the creature employs. It is his customary weapon, his familiar implement. He kills the man with a stone. He kills the woman with a stone, and he opens bottles with a stone. A brute, I repeat, a savage, disordered, unhinged, suddenly driven mad.
By what? Why, of course, by that same brandy which he swallowed at a draught while the driver and his companion were having breakfast in the field. He got out of the limousine, in which he was travelling, in his goatskin coat and his fur cap, took the bottle, broke off the neck and drank. There is the whole story. Having drunk, he went raving mad and hit out at random, without reason. Then, seized with instinctive fear, dreading the inevitable punishment, he hid the body of the man. Then, like an idiot, he took up the wounded woman and ran away. He ran away in that motor car which he did not know how to work, but which to him represented safety, escape from capture. But the money, you will ask, the stolen pocket-book. Why, who says that he was the thief? Who says that it was not some passing tramp, some labourer, guided by the stench of the corpse? Very well, you object, but the brute would have been found, as he is hiding somewhere near the turn, and as after all he must eat and drink. Well, well, I see that you have not yet understood. The simplest way, I suppose, to have done and to answer your questions is to make straight for the mark. Then let the gentlemen of the police and the gendarmerie themselves make straight for the mark. Let them take firearms. Let them explore the forest within a radius of 200 or 300 yards from the turn, no more. But instead of exploring with their heads down and their eyes fixed on the ground, let them look up into the air, yes, into the air, among the leaves and branches of the tallest oaks and the most unlikely beeches. And believe me, they will see him, for he is there. He is there, bewildered, piteously at a loss, seeking for the man and woman whom he has killed, looking for them and waiting for them, and not daring to go away, and quite unable to understand. I myself am exceedingly sorry that I am kept in town by urgent private affairs, and by some complicated matters of business which I have to set going, for I should much have liked to see the end of this rather curious adventure. Pray, therefore, excuse me to my kind friends in the police, and permit me to be, sir. The upshot will be remembered. The gentlemen of the police and the gendarmerie shrugged their shoulders and paid no attention to this lucubration. But 4 of the local country gentry took their rifles and went shooting, with their eyes fixed skyward, as though they meant to pot a few rooks. In half an hour they had caught sight of the murderer. 2 shots, and he came tumbling from bough to bough. He was only wounded, and they took him alive. That evening, a Paris paper, which did not yet know of the capture, printed the following paragraphs. Inquiries are being made after a Monsieur and Madame Bragoff, who landed at Marseille 6 weeks ago and there hired a motor car. They had been living in Australia for many years, during which time they had not visited Europe, and they wrote to the director of the Jardin d'Acclimatation, with whom they were in the habit of corresponding, that they were bringing with them a curious creature, of an entirely unknown species, of which it was difficult to say whether it was a man or a monkey. According to Monsieur Bragoff, who is an eminent archaeologist, the specimen in question is the anthropoid ape, or rather the ape-man, the existence of which had not hitherto been definitely proved. The structure is said to be exactly similar to that of Pithecanthropus erectus, discovered by Dr. Dubois in Java in 1891. This curious, intelligent, and observant animal acted as its owner's servant on their property in Australia, and used to clean their motor car and even attempt to drive it. The question that is being asked is, where are Monsieur and Madame Bragoff? Where is the strange primate that landed with them at Marseille? The answer to this question was now made easy. Thanks to the hints supplied by Arsène Lupin, all the elements of the tragedy were known. Thanks to him, the culprit was in the hands of the law. You can see him at the Jardin d'Acclimatation, where he is locked up under the name of 3 Stars. He is, in point of fact, a monkey, but he is also a man. He has the gentleness and the wisdom of the domestic animals, and the sadness which they feel when their master dies. But he has many other qualities that bring him much closer to humanity. He is treacherous, cruel, idle, greedy, and quarrelsome, and above all, he is immoderately fond of brandy. Apart from that, he is a monkey. Unless, indeed. A few days after 3 Stars' arrest, I saw Arsène Lupin standing in front of his cage. Lupin was manifestly trying to solve this interesting problem for himself. I at once said, for I had set my heart upon having the matter out with him, "You know, Lupin, that intervention of yours, your argument, your letter, in short, did not surprise me so much as you might think." "Oh, really?" he said calmly. "And why?" "Why? Because the incident has occurred before, 70 or 80 years ago. Edgar Allan Poe made it the subject of one of his finest tales. In those circumstances, the key to the riddle was easy enough to find." Arsène Lupin took my arm and, walking away with me, said, "When did you guess it yourself?" "On reading your letter," I confessed. "And at what part of my letter?"
"At the end." "At the end, eh? After I had dotted all the i's. So here's a crime which accident causes to be repeated, under quite different conditions, it is true, but still with the same sort of hero. And your eyes had to be opened, as well as other people's. It needed the assistance of my letter, the letter in which I amused myself, apart from the exigencies of the facts, by employing the argument and sometimes the identical words used by the American poet in a story which everybody has read. So you see that my letter was not absolutely useless, and that one may safely venture to repeat to people things which they have learnt, only to forget them." Wherewith Lupin turned on his heel and burst out laughing in the face of an old monkey, who sat with the air of a philosopher, gravely meditating. Chapter 8.